Welcome to the Ellen Conspiracy. Welcome to Armored Core. Throughout most of the Armored Core series, the player takes on the role of a nameless mercenary, a blank slate onto which you write your own narrative and history. Armored Core 6 is a little bit different, though. You take on the role of the augmented human C4621, a designation which indicates a specific identity and place within the fictional society of the game world. In this video, I will attempt to elucidate all we can about the identity of the protagonist, and talk about some clues which may upend some popular notions held by the community. First off, C4621 has a designation, not a name, which would suggest, as it does in many dystopian sci-fi secondary worlds, that this character has been incarcerated and dehumanized, turned into a commodity. A common assumption is that C4621's dehumanization is the result of their augmentation, which allows them to be an AC pilot. Recipients of this surgery are just treated this way. However, there are numerous other characters we encounter who are also augmented and seem to not suffer any kind of similar dehumanization and have some level of autonomy within the scope of their work. Though it is hinted in certain arena opponent descriptions that getting the surgery is sometimes an act of desperation for the less fortunate. So the reason for C4621's social standing could be related to some other event, or the specific type of augmentation. We first see 621 under a sheet, hooked up to all manner of electronic devices. It is possible we suffered some kind of injury, which has taken away our basic functions, but still allows us to pilot an AC. Another reason may be the generation of augmentation. Many lore entries describe newer generations of augmentation having safer, more stable results, and that earlier generations were more experimental, less predictable. This could be the reason for consigning 621 to such an existence, out of fear of its adverse effects.
621, are you still hearing things? Tell me if it happens on the job. I'll make adjustments.
The protagonist underwent Generation 4 augmentation, but the most recent advancement is Generation 10. This to me seems like a pretty long gap in time, which brings with it tons of interesting implications I'll talk about at a later point. Nevertheless, our character's generation of augmentation is a running source of paranoia and doubt in the other characters, to the point where our handler Walter has to vouch for it specifically.
I'll consider that mutt of yours part of the effort.
One more thing. Show my hound some respect. Gen 4's as good a pedigree as any other.
Which brings me to the next section, our relationship with handler Walter. In the first mission of the game, we salvage a license to take on the role of an independent mercenary, but this independence is just a facade.
Scavenge the AC wrecks ahead and find a valid mercenary license. We're illegals here. You'll need ID to operate.
In reality, handler Walter has complete control over us and is using us to find the coral convergence for his own mysterious reasons. In contrast, the major corporations have their own in-house augmented human squads. The relation these squads have with their corporations are the same as an employer has with their employees. The relation we have with Walter is more like master and slave. He did purchase 621, so the analogy is apt.
Well, at least you're helping me clear my inventory.
621 had no real choice in the matter. What strikes me is the whole atmosphere of this scene from the story trailer. It is very likely this was an illegal exchange, that Walter purchased 621 on the black market, that he is contributing to augmented human trafficking. This could be the reason he has to depend on an older type of augmented human, and why other characters call him infamous. So now we talk about the gap in time between 621's 4th generation augmentation and the current 10th generation. What this would suggest is that 621 is older than we typically think. But in order to get a better picture of this, we would have to get a grasp on the timescale. When did the practice of human augmentation actually start? The description of Sula's arena entry could shed some light on this. Apparently, he was active as a mercenary before the fires of Ibis, and was also a survivor of first-generation augmentation. We can assume from this that first-generation augmentation was invented around the same time as or shortly before the fires of Ibis. To support this, we can look at lore entries from the Recover Historic Data mission. Professor Nagai's logs and Ayer's dialogue indicates that coral augmentation technology was developed by the Rubicon 3 Institute.
This is about the first augmented humans. The same coral technology that created you. But without it, we never would contact.
This dialogue about Cinder Carla after the Infiltrate Grid 086 mission tells us how long ago these events transpired.
Cinder, Carla's nickname? That's what the Rubiconians call survivors of the fires of Ibis. But if the fires happened half a century ago, well, it could just be some dozer inside joke.
So Sula was on Rubicon over 50 years ago, and received Generation 1 augmentation at this time. But we don't really know when the other generations were developed, or how the practice of human augmentation spread from Rubicon to the wider galaxy, before the fires of Ibis and the destruction of the Institute. All arena entries for Arquebus's augmented human squad, the Vespers, talk in detail about the kinds of augmentation they have received. O'Keefe's entry mentions that later forms of augmentation can undo the coral burn-in of the brain caused by several earlier procedures. In contrast, the entries for Balaam's Red Guns never talk about augmentation at all, save for G5 Iguazu. I only bring this up to suggest that the emphasis on augmentation for the Vesper entries could indicate that it was Arquebus who continued research into human augmentation after the fall of the Rubicon Institute. V2 Snail, the de facto leader of the Vespers, is himself an avid practitioner of human augmentation. So we can say that Arquebus performs this procedure extensively, and not only on their own mercenaries. There is also an intentionally ambiguous comparison drawn between the practice of human augmentation and the re-education perpetrated by Arquebus.
I'll have you all sent for re-education. They will be pleased to have you.
Though the fine details are unclear, it is implied that re-education is a form of brainwashing to make one unfailingly loyal to the corporation.
I'll see that the unruly dog is punished and brought to heel.
We don't know how this exactly works, but in the battle with V2 Snail during the Eliminate Carla mission, he says this.
On augmentation that is the worst. All you know is to chase your master's prize.
Implying that Generation 4 augmentation also includes forms of brainwashing. The current and latest version of human augmentation is Generation 10. If we simply divide the intervening years by 10, we can think of a new version of human augmentation coming out every 5 years. Going by this metric, 621 would have received augmentation about 30 years before the events of the game, putting the character in their 50s at least. Of course, there is no evidence directly to support this theory, it's just a thought experiment. There are several hints in the game to suggest our character is old. First one coming from Ayer when we first make contact.
An older type of augmented human, 4th generation.
There's also this remark from Chartreuse during the Defend Gallia Dam mission.
This is great. It's the Gen 4. We belong in a museum, not PC.
According to her, Generation 4 augmented humans should be seen as obsolete, the equivalent of an Intel 386. This puts into perspective how long ago this specific procedure was developed, and gives us more context to the attitudes of other characters with regards to 621's augmentation. In addition, there is this data log found in the Attack the Watchpoint mission, which talks about a wave mutation and an aging mercenary. Now, the aging mercenary could be Sula. He is very old, as we've deduced. However, the log also mentions the mercenary serves as the trigger. Our character is the one who triggers the coral response in the generator. In this way, we can imagine the wave mutation being Ayer and the aging mercenary being 621, that they have been brought together as part of a plan by some unknown party. But there are some interesting wrinkles. Gun 5 Iguazu is also a recipient of Gen 4 augmentation, having been pressured into the surgery after gambling away everything he owned. What's odd about this is that he sounds relatively young.
And here I thought I'd just make some extra scratch. Guess I can settle the score at the same time.
And there is no lore to suggest he was augmented a long time ago. It is possible that earlier generations of augmentation are still being performed today. However, various entries make it clear that early augmentation required coral. So how could he get this procedure long after the fires of Ibis, which was thought to consume all coral in the universe? It's possible Iguazu is in his 50s or 60s and just sounds young. Stranger things have happened in From Software games. There's also the odd case of Sula. He is definitely over 60 years old, yet sounds like a man in his 30s at most.
Attacking a watch point. You're an incorrigible handler, Walter. How many of your dogs must I kill before you learn?
Perhaps the cases of both Sula and Iguazu suggest that the early coral augmentation has life-extending effects.
The spice extends life. The spice expands consciousness.
This is not a new concept for From Software games. Every once in a while you will find a character who seems inexplicably old, given the lore surrounding them. Another possibility is that 621, Iguazu, and Sula were all put into a kind of cryostasis years ago and were just reawakened recently. Though we never hear or see in the game any evidence that this sort of technology has been invented. And nothing is ever mentioned of the time skip 621 must have experienced, if this is indeed the case. It's strange that Iguazu will often call 621 a freak, even though they are of the same generation.
That freak actually did it.
Sula's dialogue is worth mentioning here.
Gen 4's not. I hear you make fine hounds with the right training. Shame you'll have to die here.
Would indicate that augmentation happened in batches, specific time intervals. This would contradict the idea that earlier generations of augmentation are still being performed long after conception. The "with the right training" could be seen as a bit of condescension, that given the right training, 621 could be equal to other generations. One interesting character to talk about is that of Snail. V2 Snail is a human augmentation enthusiast, to put it mildly, and yet he is always dismissive of Handler Walter and 621.
Know your place, you meager dog sitter. The answer is no.
Throughout the game, V2 Snail repeatedly sends you on missions in which you are expected to die.
During Operation Wall Climber, Arquebus was planning to sacrifice you.
He's willing to risk an independent over his own Vespers. Snail does not value, nor does he expect much from a Generation 4.
Did what? The bare minimum. This is just the first hurdle.
Perhaps seeing the augmentation as inferior to his own. So we can say with certainty that 621 comes from an old, outdated, experimental, failed line of human augmentation, at least as perceived by the other characters. The story trailer put out before the release of the game depicts a squad of similarly designed ACs, all using the same parts as 621's starting AC. One might assume this shows that 621 was part of the same squad. However, the salesman asks Walter,
So what happened to 617 and the others?
so 621 was purchased after the AC squad had lost their lives to destroy this laser turret. This complicates any sort of connection 621 might have had to these other ACs. The proximity and serial number does indicate they came from the same batch or lot as 621. This trailer also shows 621's Loader 4 AC starting up at the end, implying that this is their machine, an AC they have a long and storied history with. The parts of Loader 4 are worth discussing. All of the parts were developed by RAD, an organization based on Rubicon 3. This shows that they have been doing business outside the planet, that perhaps Walter was able to obtain these ACs, and perhaps the augmented humans in addition through his connections with Cinder Carla. When we take into account the deaths of 621's squad, it appears that Walter purchased 621 in a kind of last-ditch effort, a Hail Mary, to get to Rubicon 3 and find the Coral Convergence. Like any good sci-fi or mecha narrative, this puts more pressure on our task, that the odds are initially stacked against us. If we fail, Walter's plan is pretty much doomed. This has been the Elden Conspiracy, signing out.